Welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sigel. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Look, it's Orange Shirt Day, and I've got to offer my thoughts here. Because look, I don't criticize or condemn anybody who is using this day as perhaps a little bit of a celebration, but primarily as a day of remembrance, um, honoring those who perished and those who survived the 100-year policy of U.S. boarding schools, and on the Canadian side as well. Um, my concern is that somewhere along the line we start to commercialize this. We come up with nice logos, nice slogans. For those of you who are watching me and seeing me on Facebook live stream, or we'll see this in a video, um, I'm not wearing a cute logo. I'm not wearing a cute slogan. I'm saying, Deb Allen, you should be ashamed. And I don't say every child matters. I say our children matter. Because somewhere along the lines, the message got lost. I've said it before and I'll say it again. When the Black Lives Matter movement began, the immediate response from white people was, well, all lives matter. Completely missing the point. The point of saying Black Lives Matter was because the history shows that they were not being considered in the same way that everybody else was. So when we develop a slogan that says every child matters, we're missing the point too, because our children were not treated as if they mattered. And I ask, where's the proof that every child matters? There was no proof in it when they developed these residential schools and they took our children and put them in these institutions of horror. And while that is in the past, and we're going to say every child matters now, do they? I can't help but condemn the final report that came out of Deb Haaland and Brian Newland from the Interior Department on residential schools. Because what that report suggests to me is that our children still don't matter. They lowballed all the numbers. They um, they came up with this crazy scenario of assessing how much the federal government paid to do this crime without ever doing any kind of assessment or really even calling for an assessment on the harm that was done. Oh, now, granted, some people are going to say, "Oh no, I saw the 8 points that their recommendation that was in the recommendation." What they were recommending that was that there be an investigation onto the existing harm, the legacy of the harm of what took place at those schools. What are the current inadequacies that came as a direct result of those schools? But they're still not saying, well, let's look at the crimes that were done and let's assess the damages that were done to those children, not just those of us who are descendants of those children. Yes, we are carrying some of that legacy. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we aren't, because we certainly are. But to ignore what actually happened there is part of the problem. And here's one of the other issues I have. And again, I understand what people are trying to say when they say that these schools represented cultural genocide, or that these schools uh, represented linguistic or religious genocide. I'm going to say it again, and I've said it many times. There is no such thing. There is genocide, period. If you're going to put a word in front of that word, genocide, then you are changing what genocide is. What happened to our children in those schools, quote unquote schools, and those schools existed for over 100 years in some form or another. What existed in those schools was genocide. The full definition of genocide. There was violence. There were deaths. There were conditions designed to end us as a population, to extinguish us as a distinct people. That's the definition of genocide. There was sterilization that happened at those schools, and of course would continue through Indian Health Services under the auspices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the fifth, and I'll go through this again later on in the program, but they did it to our children. They developed this strategy, this policy of genocide, and they targeted our most vulnerable population, our children. And they did it knowing that if you could do it for a couple of generations, and they did it for almost 7 generations. We love that expression, 7 generations. But for 7 generations, they ripped our children away from our homes and away from our families. They punished them for clinging to any semblance of their native identity. The policy was kill the Indian, save the man. I mean, kill the Indian. And look, it'd be great to say, well, that was just a metaphor. Well, I'm sorry. Metaphors don't require graveyards. Metaphors don't require mass graves or unmarked graves. That's not a metaphor. That's what happened there. There was abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse. There was essentially torture, everything from locking kids in cages to underfeeding them, to malnutrition, and healthcare. Oh, forget about healthcare. These kids were placed in the most dangerous situations for both what they were expected to do from a work standpoint to how tuberculosis, Spanish flu, all of these diseases that raged through the rest of the country were even compounded more by the lack of quarantine or adequate health care at these schools. These kids died at a rate that sometimes the mortality rate at these schools was in excess of 50%. That means half of the children died in these schools. And what do Brian Newland and Deb Haaland say about that? They said, well, we've determined that at least 970 children died in these schools. At least? What the hell is at least? We know that at Carlisle Indian School alone, they had over 200 marked graves. We don't know about unmarked graves, but we also know that Carlisle developed a policy of sending home the deathly ill kids, sending them home. They died on the train. They died before they got home, or they died at home. One study suggests that Carlisle alone may have been responsible for over 700 deaths. Between the death that took place at the schools, the deaths that took place at the schools, and the deaths that would take place from what those children incurred at these schools. That's the truth. You want to talk about truth and reconciliation? Let me explain what reconciliation means. Reconciliation is the act of bringing two people in conflict, or two groups of people in conflict, back together to friendly, equitable, and cooperative relationships. When did we have that? When did Native people in the US or Canada have this friendly, equitable relationship with Canada or the United States? When did we have that? So how do we talk about reconciliation? What are we reconciling to? Back to a more subjugation? Or perhaps a different policy? Look, the 5 policies of the United States towards Native people was extermination, removal, which was part of that extermination, forcing us off of our lands, assimilation, termination, which is what those first 3 things led to when they said, okay, we think we've taken enough away from you, like through residential schools, that we don't even have to recognize you. We killed the Indian within you, so we can terminate even suggesting that you're Native people anymore. And then self-determination. Now, self-determination sounds great, but it's not. It was never self-determination. And in fact, the United States, when they were confronted with this prospect of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they flat out said, we don't define self-determination in the by the international standard. We just mean internal stuff. We just mean they can be an organization that has a certain amount of self governance within. They rejected the notion of sovereignty. They rejected the notion of autonomy and distinction. As far as the federal government was concerned, we are no more distinct than than the Italian communities or the Polish communities or any of the other ethnic groups within the United States. But first and foremost, Americans. That's what they were driving towards. That's what the entire policy was about. This was never about education. It was never about saving our children. Kill the Indian, save the man. You know what they meant by save the man? Wiping away enough of who we were, either in total or in part, enough that we could be one of them. This was about transformation. This was considered a war crime. It was called denationalization, the stripping away of national character and the imposition of another nation's character. That's what it was. And look, we didn't define that. We didn't define denationalization, nor did we define genocide. That was done because of other parts of what was happening in other parts of the world. But let me just for humor me for a second. Let me read what the term genocide actually is. The legal term genocide refers to certain acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Genocide is an international crime according to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 1948. That act constitutes genocide, or the acts that constitute genocide fall into 5 categories. Killing members of the group. Yeah, that happened. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Yep, that happened. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now, look, you can throw your idea of cultural genocide into that one category, but it was much greater than that. This wasn't about taking away our language or our clothing or our symbols or our ceremony. No, it was much more than that. That was number 3. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Well, sterilization was a part of what they did. That was their health care. Yeah, sterilization. It started there, and it continued throughout much of the Indian Health Service's work. And the 5th one was forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That sounds like the definition of residential schools, but it's the definition of genocide, one that we didn't come up with. So I'm sorry. I'm not trying to condemn anybody who has used words like cultural genocide. I'm just saying stop. Stop doing it. Stop using words that change the meaning of the actual word. And again, what I wanted to be clear is that genocide, all of those things that are done, those 5 acts, in order for it to be genocide, it has to have the intent to destroy a people. Well, that's exactly what the residential schools was all about. This 100-year strategy of taking our children was to eliminate us as a distinct population. I mean, look, there's no denying that. And do you know how many times the word genocide shows up in Deb Haaland and Brian Newland's report? 0. And you know how many times it showed up in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report on the Canadian side? 0. Although they did say cultural genocide. Because for some reason, we think if we add words to a word salad, that it somehow becomes more nutritious, I guess. But it doesn't. It alters the meaning. It diminishes the violence that took place at these schools. It diminishes the intent of these schools, which was destruction. It was the elimination. It was to make us extinct as a people. It was to kill the Indian within us, they said. So, by all means, we should remember those who perished in those schools. But we should also remember all those kids who perished in part in those schools, who lost I mean, look, we're still struggling with language issues today because of this. And yet, we're going to sit there and prop up code talkers. Oh, how great is it that our language speakers were used to save America? Well, that's just bullshit. I mean, at the same time that they were militarizing our language, they were destroying it in residential schools. You know, and here's the crazy part. When that phrase really became coined, "kill the Indian, save the man," it was like in the 1890s. Native people were still not counted among the U.S. population for the purposes of a congressional apportionment. Now, I'm not saying that we should have been, but it's important to realize the context that with which we were held in. We were not considered U.S. citizens. They would try to force that on us in the 20th century. A fairly recent, it's only 100 years ago that they tried to force that on us. But they started out by calling us wards of the state. How did they pull off this residential school thing anyway? Well, they said that we were disabled. The very nature of being a Native person was a handicap. It was a mental disability. New York State said that they were the irredeemable children of the state. Irredeemable simply because they were Native. It was looked at as a malady, one that could be corrected perhaps, but frankly, it was a malady that they may have considered terminal, fatal, and many children died in these schools. This is the way we were viewed. We were viewed as incompetent, primitive, savage, barely human individuals. But with the proper training, we could be made into a human being, a productive human being to their society, not to ours. So as we sit here on September 30th, 1924, I'm sorry, 1924, that's when they made us citizens, 2024, I think it is important to remember what happened. But in order to remember what happened, we have to say it. We have to speak the truth. We can't say, well, at least this many people had suffered. Or we can't say, well, at least we survived. I don't want this day to be considered a day to honor resiliency. I want this day to be a day that we hold them accountable for what they did. And I don't care if you put two Native people in office at the Interior Secretary, as the Interior Secretary or the Assistant Secretary. I don't care that you put Native people in the service of the United States government to whitewash this thing. I'm not going to allow it. So no, I'm not wearing a pretty shirt. I'm not wearing one with feathers and children. I'm saying, Deb Haaland, you should be ashamed of yourself. Because the only way we can assert that our children matter is to pursue justice for this crime that was done. And it was a crime. It's a crime punishable. And let's be clear. The definition of genocide was developed as a war crime and recognized as a war crime in the 1940s, in post World War II. Those schools were still in existence. I was still in school while those schools still existed. They weren't technically ended until 1969. I was born 10 years before that. So, if we're going to treat this day as a day of remembrance, then we better really remember. And the only way we're going to remember is to tell the truth. Our children were enslaved in these schools. They were put to work not only in the service of those schools, but then they were loaned out to farmers. They were loaned out to households. Those children had to sometimes dig the very graves that their friends, their fellow inmates, were going to be buried in. They were asked to bury other children. This is what happened at those schools. Yes, our language was forbidden and forgotten and buried with some of those children. Yes, our children were beaten, they were raped. All these churches who ran these schools, and they ran over more than 50% of them, who now will stand in righteous indignation about abortion. They had no trouble aborting children born of children at those schools. Clergy sex abuse? You think it started in Boston? A couple of altar boys getting molested? You think that's where it started? No. It started long before that. But I'll tell you where it was allowed to breed and spread and become a culture. It was in these schools. Those churches had unfettered access to our children. They had power of attorney over our children. They could do anything to them. And there was no oversight. Oh, yeah, a couple of reports were done condemning them. But those schools never got a report card. Carlisle Indian School allegedly had over 10,000 students. That's what they call them, students. They had 10,000 children who went through their halls, went through their doorways. They can only document 158 of them graduating. They buried more children than that. They sent more children home to die than that. So, no, I won't accept cultural genocide. No, I won't. In fact, I won't accept any word being stuck in front of that word. Genocide includes using culture to exterminate a people, or to eliminate culture to exterminate a people. It includes killing children. I'm sorry. It includes killing people. It includes mental and physical abuse, including sexual abuse, with the intent of destroying a people. It includes creating the conditions that would make a people cease to exist as a distinct people. It included sterilization of men and women. And it included, just specifically, in the definition of genocide, taking children and putting them under the control of another group of people. In this case, churches or the government. It's not like there's a question here. Like I said, you can almost, residential schools are the definition of genocide. So for anybody to suggest that there's a question here, or to think they've got to flower up the term somehow, yes, they killed our language. Yes, they destroyed culture. They stripped the kids from these culture. And here's the other thing, and I've got to say it. I've just got to say it. All this was happening while white children were not just encouraged to play Indian from what they saw on TV or they read in their comic books or whatever else. It became a part of their education that they could claim Native identity. They could be the Indians. They could be the Cambridge Indians. Or the Neshaminy Redskins. Yeah, they could be those, they could grab that identity. While our children couldn't even have any of their identity, they could make up an identity. They could butcher our existence. They could mock our existence. And these are all, taxpayer-funded schools. And even now, in the wake of the work that I did to create and to push through a statewide ban here in New York on public schools using Native mascots, there's still pushback. I get into these racist conversations every single day. The Washington NFL team, which finally changed its name and its logo, every day a post on Facebook. Oh, they're going to bring back Redskins. No, they're not. No, they're not. We won't allow it. And while you're claiming that identity for all of those for decades, our children were being beaten to have that identity stripped from them. That's what happened in those schools. Death and destruction happened in those schools. And so what about all those children who died? I'll tell you what about them. On the Canadian side, Canada refuses to investigate the sites of those schools for for buried children. The nations themselves had to collaborate with engineering firms to bring in ground penetrating radar. And in the only about a dozen of those schools that they've investigated, they've already located and identified possibly 10,000 children buried at those sites. Only at about a dozen sites, less than a dozen sites. Out of the 140 schools plus on the Canadian side, they've only investigated a handful. And they've already come up with the likelihood that they've identified as many as 10,000 children buried at those sites. The U.S. hasn't even begun, and they won't. Deb Haaland and Brian Newman issued their final report. Oh, yeah, they had some action items at the end: a public apology, building a monument, maybe transferring those school sites back to the native peoples. Yo, we want land back. Not sure we want that land back. We don't just want the sites of the Holocaust. We want the productive lands back. We want our autonomy back. No, there's nothing in Deb Haaland's recommendations about that. But what they did was they did a calculation. No, not a calculation on the damages, not a calculation on the harm, not a calculation on the losses, not a calculation on the cost to us. They did a calculation on the cost to them. They tallied up all of the congressional appropriation for these schools. And then they adjusted it for inflation. And they came up with a number $23.3 billion is how much the United States spent in the commission of this crime. And that's just the cash that they spent. That's not talking about the power that they doled out to churches and other organizations to commit crimes on their own without being funded. Look, they created this entire culture of abuse. But there was many schools that were never federally funded, but operated under the same mantra: kill the Indian, save the man. We incurred that cost. They didn't. But they came up with $23.3 billion. And then suggested, well, perhaps an equivalent amount should be used to compensate and to adjust and to make it right. So you're going to calculate the cost of commissioning a crime and offer that as the settlement? In what world does any entity create a condition or a product or a service or do some crime against the people, and then they're asked, well, how much did it cost you to commit that crime? How much did you have to pay to do that? And that's the settlement? And and here's the worst part of it. They're not going to pay that. They won't pay even anything close to that. In fact, the first time I heard this, and I almost fell out of my chair, the news interviewer said, oh, $23.3 billion, that's a lot of money. And the native person being interviewed said, well, it wouldn't have to be paid all at once. It could be, it could be done programmatically over a course of years. So they're not even going to ask them to put the money up. They're going to say, no, you can just budget it in and create another bureaucracy, abusive, condescending bureaucracy that you can claim you're funding as some sort of just compensation. Let me remind you that when Eloise Cabell began her suit, which turned into this class action suit against the United States government, the Interior Department, the Treasury Department, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, all of it, there was some estimation that the losses incurred by the mismanagement of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which included everything from flat out losing money to misappropriating money to not being able to account for anything, the losses may have been in the $100 billion range. The George W. Bush administration was already tossing the idea of a $40 billion settlement around. But the Obama Biden administration, they settled it for pennies on the dollar. $4 billion. $4 billion they settled the Cabell suit for. They wrote checks and they created a bureaucracy. In fact, the bulk of that money went back to white folks. It compensated white folks for them having illegally purchased native lands. And that's what will happen here. Look, they're not going to ever appropriate $23 billion. No, it's not going to happen. And it's even ludicrous to think that number is the target. Because that doesn't even come close to the damages that were done. We experienced the largest period of land loss, autonomy loss, and population loss during that 100 years. Now, was it all directly attributed to those schools? Well, much of it was. We lost population. Our children died in those schools. And even the ones who didn't die, there was no accountability. Where did the children go? Carlisle Indian School has gravestones with no names on them. It says unknown. How the hell do you have a school with children in it and you didn't even know who they were? You didn't have a name? Because here's the thing. One of the first things they did was strip our names away. If we had a name in our language, oh no, you got to have a biblical name. You got to be Joshua. You got to be Mary. You have to be Sarah. You got to be John. No, you can't have that name. So they stripped them away. Now, were these children with these unknown gravestones? Did they just have their name stripped and never given a new one? No, it wasn't even that. This is the travesty. This is the heinous atrocity that residential schools were. It wasn't cultural genocide. It was genocide. And for that, no one's being punished. This report by Deb Haaland and Brian Newland, it doesn't hold the United States accountable. It's a whitewash. Native people employed by the United States to smooth it all over and to somehow make it right. This is what needs to be discussed on this day. When that report came out over a month ago, there was a deafening silence. No one spoke about it. In fact, the few that did, and I heard it on the news, they made it sound like it was a great thing. I saw Indian Country Today, Native News Online, National Native, all of these native media sources with native journalists were still praising Deb Haaland. Nobody was condemning her. Nobody said, Deb Haaland, you should be ashamed. I'll admit, there's starting to be a little traction. But where's the so-called leadership? Where are the chiefs and the tribal chairmans and the tribal presidents? Where are all those voices? Where are the scholars and the journalists? Where the hell are you all? Where's the outrage? Yes, I've got plenty, but my outrage isn't enough. Every one of you wearing an orange shirt today, every one of you should be pissed. You should be pissed at the report. You should be pissed at this cover-up. You should be pissed at Canada and the United States for failing to ever fully account for what they did. They skipped truth and jumped straight to reconciliation. Oh, let's all come together. Let's be unified. Let's show unity. Unity my ass. Yeah, I'm pissed off. Because this is a crime. And here's the thing about genocide. If you don't account for it, it essentially never ends. Today, the United States refuses to acknowledge our distinction. That's why they voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that doesn't really recognize our sovereignty, it just recognizes distinction and lays out a minimum standard for our survival and dignity. The United States can't even meet that. Today, they can't meet that. Obama said, yes, I support the aspirations of the agreement. What the hell does that mean? I mean, you support the, what does that even, what's that supposed to mean? The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples lays out specific rights that are supposed to be recognized. Specific ones. And not nearly enough. Today, the Seneca Nation is engaged in a battle with New York State that's been going on for over 20 years, where the state has been ripping them off in the name of revenue sharing. Why? Because the federal government passed a law back in 1988 that essentially determined that we were too incompetent, too untrustworthy to run gaming industries on our territory. Even though we've been doing it for over a decade, they said, no, if you're going to do high stakes gaming, if you're going to do class 3 gaming, you have to have the states involved in your process, in your regulatory system. You have to negotiate a gaming compact with the state, and the states will have overarching and superseding authority over what happens in the game. The Seneca Nation, if they wanted to change a game and offer maybe a side bet or something like that, and I'm not a gaming expert, but if they wanted to offer something like that, they had to submit it to Andrew Cuomo and wait for his approval. And you know what happened to those requests? They sat there at his desk. So their very operation of the casinos was contingent on the governor's approval. The current governor, Kathy Hochul, froze all of the nation's assets to squeeze $500 million out of their gaming revenue, to turn around and give it to a billionaire to build a new Bills stadium in her hometown. And where was Deb Haaland? She was as silent as those people were silent over her report. She didn't say a word. They knew what New York State was doing was illegal. They knew it was wrong. The Interior Department literally told the Seneca Nation that the only way we will get involved in your compact dispute is if both parties request it. That's like telling a rape victim, unless your rapist agrees to an investigation, we're not going to investigate the crime. And I'm sorry, if you think that's an inappropriate analogy, then pick your own. But when I use the word rape, I use that word because that's what happened to our people. It happened from the first one that stepped off the boat with Columbus. Everybody talks about the disease that ran rampant through native territories. Nobody talks about syphilis and gonorrhea, though. No, they say influenza. Oh, we had a poor immune system. The first wave of deaths that came to our people came from rape. Yeah. And nobody ever talks about that in those residential schools. You know, again, don't even know what those numbers could possibly be. No, they're talking about Spanish flu and tuberculosis, cancers. If you were a child in those schools, you could die from the most minor injury or illness because of the lack of medical attention. That's the neglect part. So yeah, it's Orange Shirt Day. It's Remembrance Day. But we better make sure we are remembering all of it. And we better make sure that they can't forget it. I'm not celebrating this day. I'm talking about it, and I'll do it next year too. I'll never stop talking about residential schools. I'll never stop talking about that crime that was committed, that genocide that was committed. But if all you're going to do is praise our resiliency, then you're not doing enough. So that's what I have to say on Orange Shirt Day. Beyond Deb Haaland, you should be ashamed. And beyond, our children matter. Native children matter. Every Native child matters. You can keep all your every child matters. Let's make sure they do. Let's make sure they do. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native.